can there be morality without God? And I want to focus for a moment on that question, that we are discussing that particular question, whether there can be morality without God. We are not discussing any particular set of moral views held by any particular atheist, and that includes the views that I hold. I mention this, you might think I needn't be that specific, because there was a press release circulated by the Christian Union a few days ago which referred to an earlier debate that Dinesh D'Souza and I had had on a different topic, and then stated, "The Princeton debate promises to be even more heated as the topic is deliberately framed to focus attention on Singer's controversial views on ethics and morality." Well, I have to say that was news to me, and I think that if that's what you're here for, you might leave now. Because it's obvious that that wouldn't answer the question that we're talking about. In other words, you can't argue Peter Singer's morality is the morality of an atheist. Peter Singer's morality is indefensible. Therefore, the morality of atheists is indefensible in general. That would be just like arguing Osama bin Laden's morality is the morality of a theist. Osama bin Laden is a theist, therefore the morality of theists is indefensible. Neither is a valid argument. So I want to focus on the particular question that we are discussing without getting distracted by issues about whether views that I hold are or not right. If Faith in Action or Christian Union want to come back and organise a debate some other time specifically about my views, I'll be happy to do that. It's not what we're doing tonight. What we are doing tonight is to discuss the issue that is often summed up in the contention famously put forward by Ivan Karamazov in Dostoevsky's The Karamazov Brothers, where he said, actually he didn't exactly say this, it isn't a quote, but it is a reasonable summary: if there is no God, everything is permitted. So I want to say, well, should we believe that? Why should we believe that? Why would anyone think, for example, consider any of the atrocities that we have sadly had to witness in this century, young as it still is? Think about 9/11, think about Darfur, or about the Congo, what's been happening there, or more recently, just very recently, fresh in our memories, what happened in Mumbai. And ask yourself, well, if there were no God, would all that be permitted? One question that might occur to you then is, well, what do you mean, permitted by whom? So, obviously, these actions, these atrocities, are not permitted by law in any nation, as far as I'm aware, these sorts of things. And even now internationally, we have a developing body of international law. We have an international criminal court which exists to make sure that even where these things, these crimes are not prosecuted in the country in which they're committed, that they are against international law and that people can be tried in the International Criminal Court, despite the best efforts of the professedly Christian administration of this country over the last 8 years to undermine the status of the International Criminal Court and to refuse to be part of it. So these things are not permitted by law, but of course we're not really talking about law, we're talking about morality. You might say, if you're a theist, that such acts are prohibited by God, and if there's no God, well, obviously they're permitted. Well, certainly it's true that if you're an atheist, you can't say they're prohibited by God. But first, the fact that theists can say that some acts are prohibited by God doesn't make it true that they are. And if there is no God, then it's obviously also not true that they're prohibited by God. That statement is false. So I'm just going to take 1 minute of my time, perhaps, to say why I think they can't be prohibited by God, because there isn't a God in the sense of a God in the Judeo-Christian tradition. There are other gods about which perhaps I might have other doubts, but the God of the Judeo-Christian tradition is supposed to be a God who is omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. And if you look at the world around us, indeed, if you look at some of the very events that I've been describing, I don't think there could be such a God in this world, because such a God would not permit these events to take place. Now, if you might say, well, these events that I've described occur through human free will, and for some reason that's a greater good than the evils that humans commit, that still doesn't resolve the problem, because there's also immense suffering that occurs without any intervention of human free will. For example, people die not only because they're killed by other humans, but they die in droughts, and they die in floods, and they die in earthquakes. And often these people are innocent of any conceivable sin because perhaps they're a year old, and they die slow, lingering deaths. And it's hard to see how that can be justified or defended by free will. And even if, although I think this is a repellent doctrine, you were to say they suffer because they too have original sin, since they are descended from Adam and Eve, as indeed some Christians would say, we still have the insoluble problem of the suffering of non-human animals who are not descended from Adam and Eve, do not take part in original sin, and yet suffer slow, lingering deaths in droughts and famines and earthquakes, just as humans do. So I think there is no reconciliation of the existence of that kind of suffering and the kind of God of the Christian and Jewish traditions. So I think that it's not a good argument to say that these things are not permitted because God prohibits them, because you would need to defend the idea that such a God exists. So I think that the question, can there be morality without God, really comes to a question of, can there be morality given that we are in a universe without God? But of course, we can suspend our disbelief in God and ask questions about what difference would it make to morality if there were a God. So let's again then ask, why would one think that these acts that I mentioned, that I'm sure we all think and I think are morally wrong, would not be morally wrong if there were a God? And I'm going to mention three claims that people might make in defense of this. So the first claim is that the very concepts I'm using, the expressions right or wrong, even good or bad, would be meaningless if there were no God. They only have meaning in a universe with God because what they really mean, good and something we're obliged to, mean right, that God wills them. And conversely, that something is wrong or bad, we ought not to do it, means that God wills that they not exist or that they not be done. So we have a meaning to the words through God's will and God's commands. This is a famous position, but also one that has been famously refuted right in the early stages of Western philosophy in Plato's Euthyphro, where essentially the argument was, so what about these things that I've talked about, say? Obviously Plato wasn't talking about those things, but what about these things? Are they only wrong because God says they are wrong? Or does God say does God condemn them, does God command that we not do them because they are wrong? And I think that's very puzzling for the person who defends the view that there is no meaning to right or wrong without the existence of God. Because if you say that they're only wrong because God wills them, or wills the good, condemns the bad, then you're essentially saying that God could have willed the opposite. God could have willed that we drop bombs on villages consisting entirely of civilians. God could have willed that we hack off the limbs of children in order to carry out our civil war in the Congo, or in Darfur. And that would have been the right thing to do if God had willed it. And you can't say God wouldn't have willed it because it would have been wrong, because on this conception, there is no meaning to it being wrong except that God wills it. So that doesn't seem a very plausible position to take. We really have to take the view that these things would have been wrong, that God, if you like, if you believe in God, condemned them because they were wrong of their nature, of their intrinsic nature. But then you have to admit that there is a meaning to the concept, at least, of right and wrong, independent of God's command. God doesn't give that term meaning, it has meaning prior to him. So the first claim, I think, does not survive that argument. The second claim sometimes made is, we can't know what is right or wrong without God's revelation to guide us. So yes, the terms have meaning, but we would be lost. We would be at sea, not able to separate right from wrong. Well, if there were a God, and if he had revealed his will about what is right or wrong, in clear and indisputable language that we could all accept, then perhaps you could run this line. Then perhaps you could say, God did reveal to us what is right or wrong. But he did not do that. It's quite extraordinary how often religious people refer to some sacred text as if it were the source of all moral knowledge, and then ignore half, the inconvenient half, of course, of what it actually says. And we have plenty of examples of that in the Christian world today, including in this country. For we're living in a society in which most people, anyway, say that they are Christian. And yet, they ignore the repeated insistence of Jesus in the Gospels that everyone, and especially the rich, should give to the poor. You remember that bit of it? You remember when he told the rich man, sell all your possessions and give them to the poor? In case you didn't get the message, he went on to say, it's as hard for a rich man to go to heaven as a camel to go through the eye of a needle. That sounds like it's not a good policy to remain rich if you want to go to heaven, doesn't it? Yet there's lots of rich Christians still in this country. That's a bit of the gospel that they don't really seem to want to follow. And there's lots of other injunctions, for example, many of them in the same course. He urged those who give feasts to invite the poor, the maimed, the lame and the blind. Most of you probably had a feast last Thursday. Hands up, those who invited the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind. Don't see a lot of hands. I see one or two hands. Very good. Congratulations. That's excellent. That's nice to see. But there's about 800 people in this room, and I saw a dozen or so hands maybe. So I think that we are not actually getting our guidance. People, Christians generally, do not follow. They choose selectively which bits of the Bible they want to follow. Consider what Jesus is reported to have said about divorce. Divorce, he said, either is just wrong altogether, depending which bit of the Gospels you read, or it's only permitted on the grounds of adultery. There's not many Christians, there are some, but there's not many Christians who adhere to that. Even fewer adhere to the idea that to marry a divorced woman is itself to commit adultery. Don't know a lot of Christians who refuse to marry a divorced woman. Not a divorced man, apparently, by the way. Not too sure exactly what the basis of that distinction is. On the other hand, Christians in this country seem to think that they have a lot of guidance from God in Christianity about views about abortion, about the use of obtaining stem cells from embryos, about homosexuality. There's no clear guidance in the Gospels anyway, in the New Testament, about that. People may say, well, it's not just the New Testament, we go to the Old Testament as well. But once you go to the Old Testament, you find a lot of amazing things that God is supposed to have said and commanded, and your job of working out which ones you want to follow is more difficult than ever. For example, God explicitly advocates genocide in the Old Testament. Not passages probably very often read in church, but look at Numbers 31, where God commands the Israelites to wreak his vengeance on the Midianites. And when they go there and destroy their villages and kill their cattle and slaughter the men, they bring back to Moses the women and the children. And Moses is angry. Moses said, "Why have you spared the women and the children? Go and kill them. Go and kill all the women who have known men by lying with them, and kill all the boys. But the girls who haven't known men, keep them for yourselves." Is that where you want to take your moral guidance from? I don't think so. So the scriptures that we have are not guidance to moral thinking. If we want to use them, we have to use our own judgment. We have to sort out for ourselves what's right and wrong. And that's what we're doing anyway, whether we take the scriptures as a sacred text or just take them as an interesting work of literature to discuss and think about. 2 minutes? Thank you. Okay. So let me move to the third claim. The third claim is that even though the terms right and wrong make sense, and even though we can find out what is right and wrong, nevertheless, people won't do it. This is perhaps what Ivan actually had in mind in the Karamazov brothers, because one thing he actually does say, this is a quote, "If there is no immortality, there is no virtue." Now, I admit it would be nice to believe that all the virtuous are going to be rewarded in an afterlife and all the wicked are going to be punished in an afterlife. And it would be even better, of course, if people believed that and acted in their long-term self-interest so that they didn't do things that they believed to be wrong because of this concern about punishment. But it actually doesn't seem to work. It's quite an interesting sociological fact. Of course, I think it's difficult to believe in the first place for reasons that I've spelled out, but it doesn't really seem to work. That is, when we compare more Christian countries with less Christian countries, like this one, for example, with European countries that have a lower level of religious belief and observance, we find that many of the things that Christians condemn are actually more common here. Murder is more common in this country. We have a higher prison rate. And incidentally, some statistics I saw, a little bit dated, suggested that the number of atheists in prison was less than 1%, whereas of the prison population, whereas in the population as a whole, it's regarded as being perhaps 5, 8, 10%, considerably disproportionately small number of atheists in prison. Maybe they're just clever and don't get caught, of course. Let's go on. Abortion rates, teenage pregnancy rates, they're also higher in this country. Juvenile, we also don't look after despite the injunction I talked about, we don't look after the poor as well in this country as we do in Europe. We have higher rates of poverty and we have less social support for those who are in poverty. And then, of course, we have the mystery of the various religious people, both evangelicals and Catholic priests, who are constantly talking about sin, constantly emphasising sexual sins in particular, and are constantly committing them. Well, it's puzzling, isn't it, that if they believe in punishment in the afterlife, this doesn't seem to help them to control their urges, which we all have and which are sometimes difficult to control, but it doesn't seem to be successful in helping them to urge it. So I would say that none of these grounds, just sort of one more point, none of these grounds really would help us to believe in a morality without God. So I'm sure Dinesh is going to say that I've said a lot of negative things, but I haven't said anything about what ethics is. So I think since I'm out of time now, but I do have some time coming up after Dinesh has spoken, I'm going to say, hold on, you will get the answer to that question after we've heard from Dinesh.
You can't really talk about modern atheism without talking about morality, and you can't talk about morality without talking about Peter Singer. The Australian philosopher isn't just an atheist, he is a humanist who has spent decades dragging ethics out of the realm of religious dogma and into the harsh, rational light of secular scrutiny. His ideas are simple, radical, and often deeply unsettling, man, because Singer doesn't just let non-believers off the hook. If there is no God, he argues, then morality isn't just a personal preference, it is a responsibility, and that responsibility extends further than most of us are comfortable admitting. I bet most of you have already heard Singer's most famous thought experiment, the drowning child, which cuts straight to the heart of his philosophy. The argument basically goes something like this. Imagine walking past a shallow pond and seeing a child drowning. You could easily save them, but doing so would ruin your experience expensive shoes. In that situation, ladies and gentlemen, will you walk away or save the child? Of course, you would. Any decent person would save the child, man. But then Singer asks, why do we ignore the millions of children dying from preventable poverty when we could save them for the cost of these same shoes? Or even less. This is usually the core of his argument. If morality is about reducing suffering and not about divine commands, then our obligation to help doesn't stop at our front door. It extends globally, demanding far more from us than most religions ever have. This idea, which is also called effective altruism, has become Singer's signature contribution to secular ethics. It's not enough to feel like a good person, you have to do measurable good. And this will often mean donating to the most cost-effective charities, choosing careers where you can make the biggest positive impact, and even rethinking luxuries when the money could save lives elsewhere. So yeah, it's not a surprise that for Singer, atheism isn't just about rejecting gods, it's about stepping up to the moral plate in a universe without cosmic justice, and that's where things for most people usually get uncomfortable. That's because Singer follows his logic wherever it leads, even to conclusions that make people recoil. Take his views on animal rights, for instance, which stem from the same principle that suffering matters regardless of the species. In his book, Animal Liberation, he argues that factory farming is a moral atrocity, not because animals have rights in a legal sense, but because their capacity to suffer makes their interests ethically relevant. And this argument wasn't just about philosophy, ladies and gentlemen. It helped ignite the modern animal rights movement. But it also exposed the hypocrisy that many atheists who pride themselves on rationality still dismiss animal suffering because, well, bacon taste pretty good, man. But as you've seen, Singer doesn't let shit like that slide, man. And that's what makes him one of the most important people in this conversation. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was it. I really hope that you enjoyed the video. Please let me know what you thought in the comment section below. Remember to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one, man. Peace.